Last night, I went to see Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey movie in the premiere here in Montreal. And obviously, I went with some trepidation because of all of the criticism that has come up and all of the questions that have come up about the casting and what's going on. And I have to say, I was hoping that some of these decisions were superficial, that they weren't going to enter into the story, weren't going to taint, the story with politics and, kind of subversion. And oh my goodness, not only did the story not do that, but it did even more. The story that Christopher Nolan told, the way he told it, is one of the most meta things I've ever seen. The entire movie is a Trojan horse.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
In the past few decades, we have seen many movies in which there is a kind of trickery that is used. There's a kind of subversion. There's a bait and switch in which we tell you that you're going to watch the story of this or that hero, that you're going to watch something that you would care about, that would tell a great kind of adventure story. And then ultimately, when you go and watch the movie, you realize that it's just propaganda, that you realize that it is, it's actually a kind of vehicle for a message that is annoying and political and bashing you over the head. And it's been frustrating. And to me, when I watch, Hollywood kind of collapse, I'm happy to see it happen because they've been completely taken over by messaging and, a kind of political hammer to hack at political enemies. And in this movie, Christopher Nolan does the opposite of that. Christopher Nolan takes what on the outside looks like giving in to kind of postmodern tropes about using diversity as a political tool, changing, race swapping, gender swapping, doing all that with the characters that people do for a political tool, and transforms it, turns it into a Trojan horse for an amazing story, for a story that we need to see, and a story that is desperately one that we want and need to hear right now. We have to remember that, in a lot of the media, in a lot of the stories that we've had before, it wasn't the fact that having female characters or having characters of diverse origins that bothered people. Those have always existed in storytelling. We've always had stories like that. The problem was using the swap and using the change to kind of make it into propaganda. That is what is very frustrating. Nobody has a problem with the movie Aliens with a female lead, but then people have a problem with the Marvels because the use of a female leads in those movies is just used to bash on people and to try to get them to swallow some political message, right? And so in this movie, what happens is that a lot of people are frustrated. And at first I was wondering, I was like, why are they doing this? Why is Christopher Nolan giving in to this? But ultimately, I'm telling you, you have to go see it because he turns everything on its head. He actually uses this in a kind of double inversion, in the way that my brother Matsir talks about the double inversion, kind of like the end of Clown World, where he presents something as a kind of trick on a trick, and it turns back into a wonderful, beautiful story. And one of the things that kind of, at first I was watching the movie, I was actually, annoyed with some things and then really enjoying the movie. And then I started to see what Christopher Nolan was doing. And I realized, oh my goodness, this is absolutely brilliant. You see, you have to remember what this story is about. The Odyssey is the story about the character of Odysseus, the character of Ulysses, is a trickster. And he's a trickster through his story. He's a trickster until the end. He pretends to be a beggar in his own house. in order to trick the suitors to be able to kill all of them. He tricks all these people through his story. And of course, in this version of the Odyssey, they add the part from the Aeneid, which is not in the Odyssey, which is that the entire thing starts with him tricking the Trojans with the Trojan horse in order to take over the city of Troy. And so at some point you realize, oh, wait a minute, this movie is a Trojan horse. This movie is like a reverse Trojan horse where he has put on a kind of veneer of postmodernism, but inside is the story of the return of the king, the return of the father, the remembering of your home, the returning home, and then the passing of authority to the son, the ennobling of the son who will replace the father in an act of filiation rather than an act of revolution, which is what we've seen in the past decades in storytelling. So there's a big scene at the beginning of the movie in which Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, is being trained by the blind servant of his father. As his father is left, his blind servant that is still faithful to him is training Telemachus in fighting. And he's fighting with this sparring partner, and he keeps getting bested by the sparring partner. And the blind man obviously can hear just the sword, and he says, I can just hear the sword hit, and I know what you're doing wrong. And he says, you're defending yourself too quickly. Your reaction to the attack comes too quick. And he says, you need to slow down. You need to invite the attack. You need to give this impression that you're opening up your chest to like invite the attack and then use that to your advantage, right? And in some ways like trick your opponent into being defeated. And, that's right at the beginning of the movie. And when I was watching it, I thought, what a strange scene at the outset to put in the movie. And it's only as the movie was unfurling that I realized that this is what the movie is about. This is what's going on in this entire movie, that this whole movie is about trickery and is about letting yourself, seem to look like you're being abused in order to finally deal the final blow. And then you remember that that's how the entire story of the Odyssey ends, that the entire story of the Odyssey ends as Odysseus pretends to be a beggar in his own house, pretends to be nothing, and lets the people in the house, the suitors who are trying to take what is his wife, and kill his child, let them abuse him for a certain amount of time in order to see their weaknesses, and then ultimately reveal himself and retake the house. And so this is just an image of the kind of thing that the entire movie is doing, and the entire, the entire Judah move that Christopher Nolan is doing for us in this movie. And it's pretty stellar to watch. And, you have to see it to know, you have to see it to believe it. But I'll give you one simple example so that you can know what exactly is going on. A lot of people were annoyed with the casting of Elliot Page as, a character in the story, and people thought it was going to be Achilles. And the reason why people thought it was going to be Achilles is that in the trailer, you have the sense that Odysseus is encountering this character in hell, in Hades, because in the story of the Odyssey, Odysseus goes into Hades to get some information from the blind prophet in order to know how to get back home. And so people thought it was going to be Achilles because Achilles is one of the people that he meets. But Elliot Page does not play Achilles. He plays a character, Sinon. And so Sinon is actually not in the Odyssey. Sinon is in the Aeneid. And Sinon is the character who stays with the Trojan horse in order to convince the Trojans that this is a gift and that it's not a trick. Now, in this version, what Christopher Nolan does is that Sinon actually isn't tricking. Sinon doesn't know. So Sinon is there with the Trojan horse in order to present it as a gift to the Trojans. But Sinon thinks that this is a legitimate offering to Athena. And it's only when the Trojans bring the horse in and kills Sinon that they discover that it is, in fact, a trick. And at first I thought, like, well, that's an interesting, weird change in the story. Why are they doing that? And then if you want to know how much what it is that Christopher Nolan's doing in this movie, you have to look at the places where Nolan changed the story, because he adds to Sinan's story. Sinan is such a minor character, and he makes Sinan into a pretty important character in the story. So in the story of the Odyssey, while Odysseus is away, of course, there are these suitors that come to Odysseus' house and try to convince Penelope, Odysseus' wife, that Odysseus is dead and that now she needs to pick a new husband. And while they do that, they basically eat all of Odysseus' food. They take over the house and they really abuse of the hospitality. And so not only are they trying to force Penelope to pick a husband, but they're also constantly abusing Odysseus' servants, corrupting them, taking his food. And the leader of that is a man named Antinous, who is amazingly played in the movie as this kind of evil figure. And so if you want to understand what Christopher Nolan is doing, you have to see what he changed in the story, what he added. And so what Christopher Nolan does, that he adds to the story of Sinan, in a way puts it back into the older story. And so he shows this figure Antinous as a child. And the notion is that Agamemnon, when he comes to Ithaca, in order to pick the soldiers that will fight with him in Troy, he uses lots. And so Antinous, as a boy, picks the lot that would send him to Troy. And then he turns around and tries to trade his lot with a young shepherd boy who is picked not to come. And so you can imagine this shameful situation. And so Odysseus comforts the family and says, don't worry, Antinous doesn't have to come to the Trojan War. Stay here and protect my home, stay here and protect my wife and my child as you grow up. And then he picks this shepherd boy, and the shepherd boy is Sinan. And so the character played by Elliot Page is this replacement of a man, because the man that was supposed to go fight isn't willing to play his role and ends up going in these devious ways. Odysseus picks a replacement, and this replacement is the one that goes to fight in the war. And then this replacement is the one that ultimately Odysseus uses to bring the Trojan horse into Troy. But in this version, Odysseus, it's not Sinan that tricks. Sinan is being tricked. So Sinan thinks that this is really a gift for Athena, the Trojan horse, and he doesn't know that he is actually tricking the Trojans, and finds out only later when he's in Hades. And so Odysseus uses Sinan, tricks this replacement of a man to deliver a Trojan horse, in which he is going to, ultimately bring about this story. And so in a meta way, it's the most craziest thing you've ever seen, where this character that is ambiguous is a replacement of someone who should have actually stood up and been a man, is used to trick people into accepting a story about the return of the king, about the return of the father, and the return of the son. It is spectacular, and this is the kind of strategy that Christopher Nolan uses all through the movie. And the same thing with all the other problems that people have kind of surmised was going on. Nolan just judo moves it and makes it into exactly the story you want. And the end of the movie, folks, it's really hard to tell the story in a movie, because, of course, the Odyssey is a series of vignettes of different episodes in different places where the people land. And so it's difficult to feel when you're reading the poem, or, when you're looking at the story, it's discontinuous, right? And it's in some ways is meant to be discontinuous, because you're supposed to experience the kind of chaos and the kind of wandering that Odysseus faces and feel like this desire to return home. And all of the things are wilder and wilder, right? Are related to our world now. If you look at the things that the crew goes through, the fact that they got turned into pigs and kind of fall into their own desires, the idea that Odysseus, becomes addicted to eating the lotus flower and becomes like a drug addict while he loses himself and forgets himself. And so, but, really, Nolan is able to weave it in a way that ends up being a very kind of convincing, powerful story. But really, the third act, my goodness, the return of Odysseus home. It's like, if you like the Unforgiven movie by Clint Eastwood, you are in for a treat. It is absolutely stellar and beautifully done, very powerfully done. And and interestingly enough, the movie ends in a very powerful, surprising way. It pulls on a tradition of Odysseus that is not in the Odyssey, and that Deacon Seraphim really loves about it. And it ends with not only the return of the father, but also the elevation of Telemachus, as the king of Ithaca, the new king of Ithaca. And so he comes into his own and becomes what he was supposed to be. And so it is, like I said, it is really a masterstroke. It is one of the most meta things that I've seen in a very long time, the way that Nolan is able to take a story about trickery, about a character that is involved in trickery and deceit, but it also wants to return home, and then to do a meta thing where he uses the entire movie as a kind of trickery to get people to accept the message of remembering who you are, returning home, the restoration of the husband, of the father, of the king. All of the things that I've said are really important so that we can kind of find our strength. And the movie is really also about the end of a world. It's about the end of a post-war world, because the entire frame of the movie is framed as someone who is, of course, returning from combat, has done things, has seen things, has engaged in things that are unacceptable and that are transgressive. And he knows that's what he's doing. And then all through the story, he's forced to make compromises in order to finally return home. And those compromises cost him, cost his crew, obviously, the story of the Odyssey, his crew, they all die. And, it's like, it's a tragic thing. It's a difficult thing. And so when he arrives home, he is this like broken shell. He doesn't know if he can return home. And Nolan just hammers it in beautifully that, the fact of the war itself and the scandal of the war is what is preventing Odysseus from returning home. That it's not just all the gods and all the other things, that right at the moment when he engaged in the scandal of the war and the treachery that was involved in the war, that he knew that he probably couldn't return home. And so when he finally does, and he finally does meet his wife, and he finally, goes through everything he needs to go through in order to find his wife again, who's been faithful to him, it's very satisfying. Let's just say that it's really good. Like it just really carries you, and it kind of sweeps you up. And so I would say, if you don't believe me, a lot of people, I posted on X about this, and people are freaking out, and they're like, "What's going on, Jonathan? What's happening?" Go see it. Seriously, go see the Odyssey. You will not be disappointed. First of all, in terms of a movie, in terms of cinematography, it is stellar. It is the movies that people don't make anymore. The Cyclops is just terrifying. There are scenes in the movie that come right up to horror. They come right up to horror. And the final scene, of course, in the house, the taking care of the suitors is very powerfully done and very well done. So go see the Odyssey, folks. You will not be disappointed. And remember when you're watching it, that this is a trick. This is a trick. And don't let yourself be fooled, folks. Be those that are inside the Trojan horse. Be those that can see through the deception that Christopher Nolan is bringing about in order to celebrate the return of the Father, the return of the King, and the beginning of a new world on proper foundations. And so I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope it will encourage you, and I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.